So hi again, everyone. So for those of you that have sort of just come in, this is going to be a little bit more specific in terms of looking at pre-modern texts. So we suggested a kind of 1800 split. Kind of needless to say, that's not hard and fast. So generally speaking, I will be your point of contact in terms of an editor if it's before 1800, and Richard will be if it's post 1800. But of course, some things bridge that divide, in which case we'd make a decision about which editor was best placed to deal with your text. But to kind of kick us off in this session, I'm really delighted that Daniel Patterson is with us. So Daniel was the author of one of the texts that Richard waved about in the last session, that was published in 2022. Is that correct, Daniel? I'll let you introduce the text, as you know much more about it than me, and then Daniel's going to speak just very briefly about his experience of publishing with Camden, and then we have some questions that were proposed by some of you before today, that Daniel and I will kind of speak to, and then of course any other questions that you have, do feel free to raise them. So I'll pass over to Daniel.
Yeah, thanks very much, Siobhan. So my name is Daniel Patterson. I was until very recently a research fellow at the University of Huddersfield, but now sadly I'm no longer working in the academic world, but it's very nice to come back and sort of talk about some of my old work. So without further ado, I have a little script here. So Siobhan, if I start to go on for too long, please just give me a nudge and we can move on to the questions. But I think actually I'll start with how I chose the primary source, which became my edited volume, since I expect some viewers will want to know about that whole process. And the truth is, I didn't really find my volume, it kind of found me. So I set out in 2014 to write a PhD thesis about youth and masculinity in early modern England, and plan to draw on letters, prescriptive literature, diaries, things like that. And my PhD supervisor, Chris Marsh, suggested that I take a sort of speculative look at a little-known diary held by the Bodleian Library in the Rawlinson collection. The diary was anonymous and its authorship was a mystery. So it was bound into a tiny volume, which was only 16 centimeters long and 10 centimeters wide. And it was written in an awkward and minute hand, which was often almost illegible, or so it seemed at the time. I was also pretty inexperienced as a paleographer, and so initially just thought it was, impossible to read. I didn't give up though, and I soon developed a bit of a knack for deciphering the diarist's hand, and I was able to piece together some clues and identify its author for the first time, which is quite exciting. He was a man named George Lloyd. He was the rather undistinguished brother of Nicholas Lloyd, who was a sort of little-known Oxford scholar, clergyman, sort of friend of Anthony Wood. He had a brief article describing his life in the ODNB. And so to my surprise, the volume turned out to contain not one, but two diaries, both written by the same person at very different life stages. So the first covered the period 1675 to 78, beginning when Lloyd was 33. And the second began on New Year's Day, 1717, when he was about 68. And he was working as a customs official and rent collector in London. And the second diary continued until August 1712. So I quickly decided that the opportunity to reconstruct the life of a quote-unquote ordinary person from the 17th century was too good to pass up, and decided to focus my studies entirely on Lloyd instead of my original thesis idea. And this made it necessary to produce a pretty much complete transcript of the diary, which ran to about 120,000 words across 119 folios. Producing the transcript took up almost a year of my doctoral studies. At the same time, I conducted pretty in-depth archival research to piece together a narrative of Lloyd's family background, his life between the diaries as far as I could. Fortunately, and I think largely to do with his more well-known brother Nicholas, Lloyd's life was relatively well documented for a person who was so sort of obscure and irrelevant to the grand narratives of history. We now know where he was born and when he died, who he married, what his salary was whenever he worked for the customs, et cetera, et cetera. At the point that Chris, my supervisor, suggested that I consider turning the transcript into a published edition. And so I applied to publish it with the Canton series. I think it was in 2016 originally. It was so long ago, I can hardly remember. And I naively thought at this point that I would be starting from a fairly advanced position because of the work I had already done. I would just tidy up the gaps and mistakes, of which there were quite a few, in my first transcript, write some footnotes, write an introduction. The whole thing would probably only take a few months. And it would be, really great to produce a publication like this during or just after my PhD. And this, as you might expect, turned out to be a bit too optimistic. And it's here that I feel obliged to offer some cautionary advice. Producing an edition like this of a sort of long early modern manuscript, especially one with paleographical challenges, is no small undertaking, even if you already are pretty well versed in it. So the existence of this very long transcript was a bit of a blessing and a curse. I had already done loads of work, but then whenever you actually sit down to begin making the edition, well, I personally almost didn't know where to start because there was just so much material. So suddenly I find myself being very busy, completing my thesis and applying for jobs and writing articles, and the edition kind of kept getting kicked down the road a little bit. So I finished my PhD in 2018, but it wasn't until 2019 that I actually really started in earnest on the edition itself, sort of full time. And I applied for and won a visiting fellowship at the Bodleian to allow me 2 months uninterrupted time with the manuscript. And I arrived in Oxford in March 2020. And as we all sadly know, things took an unusual turn at this point. Everyone was talking about the novel coronavirus, and after just a couple of weeks blissfully working away in Oxford, I had to leave. The country went into lockdown, and I went back to Northern Ireland, thinking that I'd be back in a few weeks. And of course, that wasn't to be. Lloyd's Diary ended up becoming a bit of a lockdown project. So, I had anticipated spending a lot of time in various archives and libraries and talking to colleagues and things like that. And I ended up working on this project alone in my study, working from iPhone images and emailing people with, panic requests for advice. So in that situation, I sort of divided the project into 3 phases. First, planning. So I started off by just reading lots of other editions of diaries, and I think that's a really important thing to do. Your work needs to kind of build on, some of the amazing work that's been done by other scholars. So whenever I was working on my PhD, I had gone for a fully diplomatic, warts and all transcription style for my own working purposes. Which was a sort of facsimile of Lloyd's Diary as far as I could make it. But whenever I went to write the edition, I decided that actually I would need to go for a more interventionist style, which silently expanded the thousands of abbreviations in the diary and tidied up some of the spelling and the punctuation, because, to be honest, Lloyd was not a great prose stylist. And I think a volume which had just been an exact facsimile of the diary would have bordered on the unreadable, and just the unintelligible. And certainly I don't think people will sit down to read the volume that I produced cover to cover, but nobody would be able to read a facsimile edition for very long at all. So then I set about perfecting the manuscript, implementing my new editorial approach, combing through it for errors, filling in gaps. And this is the aspect of the volume that I think I'm most satisfied with and which was most successful. So I think I did a pretty good job of producing a full and accurate representation of what was a very challenging manuscript in a way that served the manuscript and the reader, rather than just producing some really, opaque facsimile. And then finally, I went back through the text and wrote the footnotes and the introductory essay. And this, for me, was the most challenging part. I found it very tricky to gauge how far to go in terms of providing commentary on text, and maybe this is something we'll come back to. So my first attempt resulted in far too many footnotes. The footnotes were too long. I think historians in general love writing footnotes, often a little too much. And my introduction was too long as well. And I personally, the first time, found it really hard to resist the urge to kind of throw the kitchen sink at the project and really show off every single little bit of research that I'd done. And in reality, I think it's important to restrain yourself from doing that and really think about actually what will make the text itself sing off the page. And yeah, so it took a lot of very painful editing. I think I deleted about 600 footnotes or something like that, and there were still over 1,000 in the finished volume. And Siobhan and also my copy editor really helped me to cut things down. I just wanted to note as well that the copy editing process can be quite tricky with a text like this, because you're reproducing a manuscript that probably contains lots of, for all intents and purposes, mistakes, the irregular writing style of, the 17th, 18th century. It can be difficult to differentiate once you get to the final copy editing process, or at least I find this, between maybe possible typographical errors that you've made and, the idiosyncrasies or the mistakes that existed in the manuscript. And this is particularly, I think, whenever you're dealing with a really long and substantial text. And to be honest, that the copy editing process involved a lot of double checking, going back to the images of the original manuscript and saying, oh, did I make that mistake, or was that Lloyd? And it's difficult not to second guess yourself, I suppose. But in the end, I was able to produce a piece of work which, although very challenging at the time, proved to be a very rewarding process. Although it feels rather different to publishing a piece of writing which is sort of entirely your own creation, because you're kind of sort of co-authoring it in a way with the person who produced the original manuscript. It's really satisfying to think that you've produced a resource for other scholars, and which students and other academics might be able to read and draw upon for years to come. And I think that's everything. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks very much, Daniel. I think you spoke very eloquently about kind of the more enjoyable parts of doing an edition like this, and also the more challenging parts. And I think one of the reasons that we split today into these breakout rooms is because I think the challenges that face medievalists and early modernists with scholarly editing can be different. Of course, there are some than to modernists, and I think, of course, there are some things that overlap. But the things that Daniel mentions about, what can be quite severe paleographical challenges, which sometimes when you're reading a manuscript, you can read it to all intents and purposes and use it for your research. That's not the same as producing an edition, because an edition has to be precise. And yeah, it can be very, very easy to find a manuscript that you think should be published and actually realize that the process of publishing it will either be harder than you thought, or is not something that you want to do, or that you're able to do. And that I think is quite an important question to ask yourself kind of quite early on. Just to pick up on a couple of things that Daniel raised, you mentioned second guessing mistakes. I mean, that never stops, because you know it needs to be precise, so you want it to be perfect. So every time you check, you think, oh, is that my mistake? Is that the author's mistake? Should I put a sick in there or not? I can't put a sick in for every word, because every word is spelled wrong. So, what do you do, and how do you manage that? Partly that can be dealt with in the editorial conventions, but the process of checking and proofreading is long and tiring, and by then you've normally had enough of the edition that you're looking at. And yeah, the length of the footnotes, I think Daniel made a really good point there. The first edition that I did, I had exactly the same experience, which is that I was so intent on making sure everything was explained. And also, I think at the time I was very junior, and wanting to make it very clear that I knew, that I understood this, that I knew what this was about. And I had exactly the same process where I had to cut down my footnotes really dramatically, and it was quite a bruising and quite a difficult thing to go through. People have asked on the Padlet, what sort of support do you get from your editor, or from the Camden series, or from whatever editor, whatever series that you publish with will be similar. And I would say that we're here to advise. We're not necessarily here to make decisions. Sometimes we will say, we think this is what you should do, but ultimately it's going to be your name on the cover of the book, and you have to be happy with what you've produced. It can be a difficult process, but hopefully it does end up being a rewarding process. I mean, Daniel's volume is lovely. It's very, very well done, and I think it is an important volume, particularly because it represents a history that maybe is not written and is not exposed so much. We have a few questions that participants submitted prior to the session, but if there are any specific questions that anyone would like to ask Daniel before we address those, please do turn off your screen and unmute, and feel free to raise them. I have a hand from Christopher.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So as a person who has also not done this before, I suppose I was wondering if Daniel could speak a little bit about just the process of getting permissions. In what instances do we need to seek permissions? In what instances, how does that all work? Thank you.
Yeah, so, well, not to give a cop-out, but I think Siobhan might be more well-placed to answer this question than I would be. I don't really remember there being any protracted permissions process with the Bodleian at all. I sort of told them that I was interested in doing it, and they said, carry on. I assume that that's not always the case, Siobhan.
Yeah, so this is one of the questions that we had submitted, and which we said I would deal with. Daniel's not copying out. This was just a prior agreement. But yeah, it also can very much depend on the nature of the source. A lot of early modern or medieval manuscripts generally, it obviously is not a hard and fast rule, but generally don't necessarily need permissions because they're not in copyright, because often all the people that we're dealing with are no longer living, often their descendants are no longer living or can't be traced. So it's quite rare in my experience for there to be a hiccup. It can happen. So the first edition that I published was of a merchant's letter book. It was a 17th century letter book held in the National Records of Scotland in Edinburgh. And I did have to get permission from the family to publish it because they have a blanket kind of condition on their family deposits in the archives that none of it can be published without permission. Now, this blanket is really for modern stuff. I had no problem. I wrote to the current laird of wherever and said, I'm a PhD student, this is what I'm doing, is that okay? And he was thrilled that somebody was interested in his 17th century ancestor. So that was really very simple, but usually the archive is the person to ask. So exactly as Daniel said, normally with things from an earlier period, you'll say you're thinking of doing it or proposing it to Camden or wherever. Generally they'll be thrilled that you're doing it and very happy to help. If you do need permission, my experience of early modern and medieval manuscripts is that it's usually just a case of writing to whoever is still alive in the family and tell them what you're doing. I've never dealt with or had a personal experience of those permissions being denied. But as Richard said, I think it's definitely worth doing that at an early stage because you don't want to be in a position where you've done the whole transcription and then we can't publish it. I think this is a problem which is more common for modern, particularly very modern manuscripts where there may be bigger issues. But yeah, the easiest thing to do is just to ask the archive where they're held. If anyone has any further questions, do please just turn on your video and raise your hand. But we'll move on to some of these questions that we were submitted. We've got about 10 minutes left. So Daniel, one of the questions that I think you were going to handle was, is there anything that you wish you'd handled differently at an earlier point in your experience of doing your edition?
Yeah, I have a sort of two-part answer to this that hopefully won't take too long. First of all, I wanted to say, because I think that this is something a lot of people might sort of agonize over, and I certainly did. And I think that, if I could go back and give myself one piece of advice, it would be to really try to focus on not second guessing editorial decisions too much. I think part of doing this is accepting that, especially whenever you're dealing with a sort of rickety early modern manuscript, achieving perfection is not a possibility, and quite often you need to make sort of difficult binary decisions about how you're going to handle something, and quite often you're choosing almost like a least worst option in terms of how to approach that. So do I wish that readers of my volume were able to get a real, a better sense of how Lloyd's diary actually reads on the original page in terms of all the abbreviations, all the sort of, he put in loads of really funky and unusual punctuation that I took out because it was just, it looked so terrible on the printed page as opposed to on the manuscript. Yes, but am I happy with my ultimate decision to take all of that stuff out? Also, yes. With all that said, I think I personally wish I had taken a slightly more methodical approach. So, to be perfectly honest, beyond the 3 phases that I mentioned earlier, I didn't have a very rigorous plan. Now, I know academics tend to vary in terms of, their organizational and planning skills, and I'm definitely on the more absent-minded end of the spectrum. But I find myself doing things like, while editing a page, I would realize that there was a person mentioned in it who I find interesting, and then I would be on some online, archive repository seeing if I could find their will or something like that. And, in hindsight, I feel like I would have given myself a much easier time if I had divided the project up very strictly into, for this period, I'm going to work just on perfecting the text. For this period, I'm just going to work on finding contextual background in other archives and things like that. So that would be one thing that I probably would change.
I think Daniel, you raised a really interesting point about determining editorial conventions. Actually, there's a question from Molly in the chat that will feed into this as well. So Molly's asked, from reading other scholars' editions, what techniques did you pick up to kind of aid your own? I'm assuming you kind of mean in terms of editorial conventions and how things are presented. I will say that it's quite important, and this is a lesson I have painfully learned, to decide quite early on, if you can, what these conventions are going to be, because what you don't want to do, which I have done, is end up with a full length transcription, and half of it you've used one convention, half of it you've used another, and then you've got to go back, and going back and trying to repair those kind of inconsistencies is possible, but it's really painful and very, very time consuming. So if you can make a decision fairly early on and then stick to it when you're doing the work, and this is a kind of a case of do what I say, not how I do, because this is not really how I work, but that would be a kind of piece of advice. And I would say, people approach these projects as they do any projects in very, very different ways. So my technique, if you can call it that, is to, I guess, bash through the transcription fairly roughly and know that there are going to be mistakes in it, know that there are going to be problems, and then kind of go back and go through the whole thing and make sure it's all accurate and implement all the conventions and put in the footnotes. Other people will do it more slowly in terms of getting through the whole thing, but will do that as they go along. I would actually say that the latter approach is probably better. It's just not one that I cannot work like that. I don't work like that in any of my work. So part of it is also determining what method of approaching these kind of projects is going to work for you. But yeah, I would say making a decision about editorial conventions early on and trying to stick to it will make your life a lot easier. And yeah, Molly, from reading other scholars' editions, what techniques have you picked up? It's a great question. It kind of links a little bit to what I said earlier about different presses having different expectations or different rules, and different societies treating things differently. All scholars will have differing opinions on how editorial conventions could be used, and sometimes you see what someone's done and you think, that's brilliant, I love how they've laid those letters out, I'm going to do that next time, or I'm going to do that this time. And other times you look at it and think, I don't know how the press has allowed this to happen, this abomination of this production. And a lot of it is personal choice. It's really about consistency. It needs to be consistent. So your editorial conventions apply to the whole manuscript, and you must make sure that as far as possible, and mistakes unfortunately always do creep in, but as far as possible it's accurate in terms of consistency, and that it's usable to the reader. So as Daniel was talking about with that punctuation, it's a hard decision, because on the one hand you want to present as close to the original as you can in print, but on the other hand, if it's not readable, then it's not going to be useful to a readership. Similarly, I've done manuscripts before where I've inserted very sparing punctuation. So I've inserted full stops and I've made that clear, but I've done that because otherwise it's not readable, and then no one's going to use it anyway. So those are kind of those decisions will be different depending on the manuscript that you're working with, and that's again somewhere that your editor, whichever series you publish with, your editor should give you support, and if anything, just a sounding board really. Over the years, I've gained a lot of experience, not only in my own editions, but in working on other people's editions for the Camden series. And you really start to see how differently different people approach the same thing. And actually, my editions are not all the same in this regard. I've used different conventions in them, partly depending on publisher wish, or partly depending on what, I might go back to my first edition and do it differently now. I can't, obviously, but I probably would do it a little bit differently. But like anything, you kind of learn from experience. Question about open access requirements. So I would consider the published edition as effectively the research data. I think it probably depends a little bit. There was a question earlier about data sets, and that's not something that the Camden's explored before. I would not be averse to exploring that. In which case that might count as research data. But no, generally we would see these as publications. So we would see it as a long form publication of a type that currently doesn't need to be open access to fulfill UKRI requirements for ref. And that's probably the best way I can answer it without knowing kind of specifics about the project. But it's something that Richard and I would be very happy to discuss further. So we've got 5 minutes left. So a couple of questions coming in thick and fast now, which obviously is great. I'll try and deal with as many as I can in the next couple of minutes. So Eva, do we prefer specific style guides? We do have style guides. The Camden has a style guide. It's differently, and it's interpreted differently by every author that we have, because it with something like the Camden or any kind of series of primary text, it's determined so firmly by what the text is, what the manuscript is, and what the purpose of doing the edition is. So we do have a style guide, but as long as it's consistent within the volume, that is interpreted slightly differently across different volumes. So Adam's asking about timescale and proposals and putting things on your CV. I would say you can say, like with any publication, if it's been proposed, you can say it's at proposal stage. Just be truthful about where it is, but you can put it on I would put it on my CV at that point. If I have done, a proposal has been submitted to the publisher awaiting decision. Obviously, at the point at which it's contracted, you can say it's under contract and give a rough expectation of when it might be published. But I would put it on your CV as a proposal once it's been proposed. Personally, that's how I've always operated. As long as you're honest about where it is in the process, it's absolutely fine to put it on your CV. Digital scholarly editions, yes, they are digital. So all of our volumes now are also digital editions. I'm not sure I can really elaborate on that, but yes, it is. We don't produce solely digital scholarly editions at the moment, but again, we're not averse to having discussions about ways in which we might move the series forward in new ways. So if you have a particular idea, please do get in touch and we can discuss it. There's just a couple of things I'm going to try and get through before we finish. Somebody asked in the last session and prior to the session, if it's not an individual project, how do we structure an editorial team? It's a great question, and it just, again, it sounds like such a cop-out answer, but it's very, very much dependent on what the nature of the project is. So one of my current editions that I'm working on is co-edited, and it's very much a shared project, kind of 50-50 co-edition. So we have decided how to kind of divvy up that work, and we will be credited equally in terms of the work. We sometimes get projects where there's a lead editor, but there are other people who have contributed. It really, there's no right way of doing this. We are very happy to talk to editorial teams about how they might approach it, how they might make sure that everybody is fairly attributed in terms of authorship. But again, it's very much kind of project dependent, but it's something that is a good thing to do. It's good to do things in teams. there are different challenges doing things with other people, as I'm sure most of you know. And kind of the last thing that in the last 77 seconds I'll try and answer, or Daniel might want to come in on this, which is how do you deal with texts that are illegible, that contain corrections, crossed out words? Again, that very much varies. I've had editions where I've left the words in and put a strike through them if they're legible, because sometimes it can be actually interesting to see what was originally written with the correction. Very, very occasionally there are words that you just can't read, and that's kind of okay. Daniel, do you want to quickly say something about that?
Yeah, I had a couple of words that I just couldn't read, and initially I thought that there were actually going to be loads, and it was going to be embarrassing, you know, the number of illegible words there were going to be. But you know, my advice would be, first of all, stick with it, ask for help, send pictures around to colleagues. And then also just echoing everything that Siobhan said, I also struck through deletions that were legible so that people could read what had been deleted. And I think the most important thing is to just be clear and transparent with your reader and try to reflect as far as possible what exists on the manuscript page and what choices you've made when representing it in the volume. I think that, you know, missing sections are acceptable, but, you know, transparency about them is the most